Over the past several years, DC Comics have had multiple opportunities to reboot Batman back to a #1 issue. Once Tom King's run ends, what is that, like 95 or whatever, James Tynion takes over and something new was going to happen, they could have rebooted to a #1. Once James Tynion kind of walks away and Josh Williamson does like a little fill-in work and then Chip Zdarsky comes on board, they could have rebooted it to a #1 and they didn't do it. And I quite frankly applaud DC Comics for not going back to the reboot, relaunch, renumbering well all the time with Batman. He is their #1 comic book character. He's their flagship in a #1 Batman series. In the short term, means something. It means variant covers. It means an increase in interest from speculators and collectors and stuff like that, to where they could make some short-term gains. But over the long term, we've definitely found out that rebooting all the time is not good for comic books. It actually ends up killing their sales prematurely on the relaunch itself. Superman's another story. Superman has been rebooted and relaunched and repackaged quite a few different times. Certainly since Batman did. We did get the Peter J. Tomasi Superman run when Bendis came in. They rebooted it to a #1. When Josh Williamson took over Superman after that, they did reboot it to a #1. So it's not surprising that they're going to be doing this with Superman. But DC are going to be jumping on the reboot, relaunch, #1 hype train in 2025 with their flagship characters. DC is planning to relaunch both Superman and Batman ongoing comics in 2025. We will get a new Batman #1 to follow Jeff Loeb, Jim Lee in their upcoming Batman Hush 2 run on the series from Batman 158 to 163. And Superman will also get a relaunch alongside the release of James Gunn's new Superman movie. So apparently this is going to be coinciding, at least the Superman relaunch will be, with the Superman movie that's going to be coming out. And we know a lot of times these things get delayed, but it sounds like James Gunn's Superman is on track and it will likely release on time, and we'll be getting a Superman relaunch alongside that. I think the more interesting thing happening here, obviously, is Batman, because while Superman has been rebooted and relaunched a couple of times in the meantime, Batman's going to go well over 150 issues, which used to be standard, and actually back in the day, in the 80s or something like that, 150 issues and having to relaunch would be kind of a failure. But 150 nowadays, going to 163 is quite the accomplishment in longevity and actual success of a title, despite what Tom King absolutely did to Batman, and certainly despite what Chip Zdarsky is currently doing to Batman, which is also diminishing sales. But we do know the Batman comic series does have a silver lining coming in the not too distant future. In the very early part of 2025, Jim Lee and Jeff Loeb are coming aboard. They're going to do Hush 2. The first time Jim Lee's done like a full story arc in like over a decade anywhere. And certainly if you go and read Hush, while I don't think it's the greatest Batman story of all time, and I don't even think it's in the top 10 or probably even top 20, I think it's good, not great. It may be the best illustrated Batman comic book of all time. It's definitely in the top 5 when it comes to just illustration. I don't think the story is great, but we are getting a sequel, Hush 2, because it was a very good seller. It is Jim Lee returning, Jeff Loeb also coming in tow. Another guy that isn't quite the legend that Jim Lee is, but I love Jeff Loeb, and I would consider him a legend as well. So they're going to get a spike in sales there, but then they're going to reboot it for whoever the next writer is going to be. And we're being told that Batman Hush 2 is going to be like a 6-part story. So I would expect it, in the midpoint of 2025, you'll get a new writer. When thinking about this, who would be logically the next Batman writer? We can throw out Scott Snyder. He's done his Batman run. He's doing Absolute Batman. He's not going to do that one. Obviously, it's not going to be Tom King. He basically destroyed the franchise, and it took him a little while to recover. James Tynion does not appear to be in any rush to write DC superhero comic books. Mark Waid is doing Action Comics, and he's going to be doing Justice League Unlimited. I don't believe they would give him the Batman title. There really just aren't very many people that have relationships right now with DC that would have the schedule go on and do an ongoing Batman series that would have the name cachet associated with them. I'm not expecting DC to go back to the Marvel well and bring over Jed McKay or even Jonathan Hickman, who I do think would be the biggest name. Hickman on Batman, I think, would do gangbusters. It would re-energize the Batman fan base and bring people in. But I don't believe that one's on the table. And the most depressing thing about all this is when I look at the names that are associated with DC and who they would consider for it, the name that makes the most sense to me right now, and not from my perspective, believe me, not from my perspective. Tom Taylor's already on Detective. He's kind of out there. Despite being a DC exclusive writer, it's Jason Aaron. How depressing would that be? Jason Aaron, who hasn't had a good ongoing series in a very, very long time. He really shit the bed in Avengers. Even his Punisher miniseries sucked. We see what he's doing right now with Namor. His Conan stuff was perfectly fine, but not good. The last thing that he did that was good, that was ongoing, was probably Thor, and it was only good for a couple of years, and then he sucked for 6 years. But he's probably the only name left that has enough cachet that they could put up and say, look, we put somebody big on it, to kind of follow up on Jim Lee and Jeff Loeb. I hope I'm wrong. I hope it's Robert Venditti. I hope it's Jeremy Adams. I hope it's Tony Fleeks, or really anybody out there with some pedigree. I hope they go get Robert fucking Kirkman or anybody really other than Jason Aaron. But I'm kind of bracing myself for the inevitable announcement that Jason Aaron's going to be the next ongoing Batman, right? I'm sorry, but I think it probably does happen. Previously, both titles were meant to have a relaunch with 5G. When that was abandoned, James Tynion continued his run past 100. Chip Zdarsky took it over. He preferred a continuation rather than a relaunch. Jim Lee felt the same way when the original Batman Hush launched in Batman 608, and so got the same with Batman 158 for Hush 2. Superman has had more relaunches over the years, including the recent Dawn of DC relaunch with Josh Williamson and Jamal Campbell at the beginning of 2023. I cannot applaud them for their handling of Superman. Bringing Bendis in was an enormous mistake. It killed sales off of Superman. It dropped out of the top 50, but it really killed sales in Action Comics. And it took like a 2-year epic fucking story from Philip Kennedy Johnson in the Warworld saga to kind of just get it back into the top 100. Thankfully, it feels like it's stabilized a bit, and it's not quite the top 20 selling comic that it used to be, but it's like top 50 when we're talking about action. Superman did rebound quicker, in large part because they did put Josh Williamson on it, who is a name. I don't consider him a superstar, but as far as DC goes, he was the closest thing they had to a superstar really at the time. And he was able to kind of bounce back sales. But does this mean that they're rebooting Superman without Josh Williamson? Because this troubles me, because there's not a lot of good people out there to write Superman that I think DC would actually hire. Hey, if this is because Venditti's taken over, that would be great. He did Superman 78. He did the second volume. He's done some really cool stuff. He did the Superman story in the Walmart $5 editions, 100-page comic books or whatever, and they were all really good. But they're not going to do that. You and I both know that they would never put a competent writer as good as Venditti on there for reasons I will never figure out. We did recently get the rumors that nobody's denying that Dan Slott is going to be writing Superman. My assumption at the time was he was going to be following up John Ridley in Superman Superstars Initiative. What if he's actually writing Superman, like he's the reboot? This will be more catastrophic and devastating to Superman sales than Brian Michael Bendis. At least at one time, Brian Michael Bendis was a superstar. Now everyone had seen him for what he was in his final days at Marvel, especially starting with Civil War II, but even, Avengers versus X-Men and all that kind of stuff, where he really just kept shitting the bed over and over and over again. He was spent goods. He didn't have any stories left. They brought him over to DC, and he really, the bottom fucking dropped out on Superman, especially Action Comics, and we lost Super Son. Dan Slott's never been a superstar. The only reason he's ever sold a comic book is because it said Amazing Spider-Man, in spite of saying Dan Slott on it as well. Did he have some high times where things were better than others? Of course. People like Superior Spider-Man. The initial introduction of the Spider-Verse wasn't loathed because I don't think people thought it was still going to be around this long. But a lot of what he did was really, really bad with Spider-Man. And if they give the Superman title to him, like I don't even want to imagine just how devastating that would be to DC comic sales, because DC fans are far different with their buying habits than Marvel fans. Marvel fans will kind of ride out a dry spell with a bad writer. They'll continue buying it. Maybe they won't read it. Maybe they'll just throw it in their long box. DC fans really aren't like that. And I think the way that they've been dipped over the last few years, especially Superman fans with the Bendis thing, where we had Jurgens on Action, which was really good, but we had Tomasi on Superman and Super Sons, and they were fantastic. And I think they're tired of being dicked over, really, by the publisher. And you remember what they did with Superman and New 52. I don't even want to get into how bad that stuff was. But I do think Dan Slott would trump all of that as far as Superman fans giving DC Comics the middle finger and telling them to go fuck themselves. And I do worry. I still believe, in my heart of hearts, I still believe DC are not stupid enough to put Dan Slott on Superman, the ongoing series. I think they are stupid enough to put him on Action Comics for a Superman Superstar Initiative 3-issue story. That would make sense to a degree, would almost be defensible. Putting Dan Slott on Superman would not be defensible. And of course, this does continue the long tradition of DC doing everything in their power to be just an absolute knockoff of Marvel Comics with their reboots and hiring all the leftover talents and all that kind of stuff. In fact, in a recent newsletter, Marvel Senior Vice President and Executive Editor Tom Brevoort talked about the appeal to publishers for starting a new volume with the new number 1, as opposed to continuing the previous numbering, with DC's decision not to relaunch every comic for DC All-In, stating, "I think that if DC is satisfied with this approach, then that's all that matters. However, if they're relaunching titles with new creative teams and new directions, then they're probably leaving money on the table by not starting with the new number 1. If it's the same team, though, I can see why you would continue with the numbering." I think it's not a good idea in 2025 to look to Tom Brevoort for business advice. Look what's going on with the X-Men line. Yes, they do get boost in sales numbers and increased interest, not from readers, from speculators, from collectors, and maybe a few people still hoping maybe X-Men will get good again, but you're going to see the precipitous drop-off that will trump anything that happened in the Krakoan era, because we've seen it time and time again. This reboot back to number 1 so you can get variant covers and speculators back into the market en masse has turned out to be an enormous pile of fool's gold for publishers, and the fact that the drop-off is almost always worse unless you have a really great creative team and they actually tell a good story. That's not going to happen here, especially if it's with Superman. Hopefully they're able to regenerate interest in Batman and kind of wash away the stain of Chip Zdarsky. They were able to successfully do it with Tom King, but James Tynion was probably a bit more beloved. He had done Detective Comics. Chip Zdarsky seemed like it could be a good idea at the time. In fact, I championed it myself. Boy, was I ever wrong on that one. But it's the Marvel route again. DC is doing everything in their power to just be Marvel Comics' little brother that gets slapped around and made fun of by everybody else. And that's unfortunate, because DC do have a far better comic books right now than Marvel do. Marvel wish they had as many good books as DC has. If you like what I'm doing here on Think Critical YouTube, providing a unique perspective, some honesty, and a little bit of levity to this comic book industry that sorely, sorely needs it, and you would like to support me in my mission, my efforts to do that, I do want to invite you to come visit me on the Patreon. We got lots of tiers with extra podcasts and videos and all kinds of bonus material in there. There's a link in the video description. 3 different tiers to choose from. I hope to see you there very soon, because I know you're going to love the extra stuff that we got going on the Patreon.